Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. This is a podcast for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, whether that's at work or at home, and it's for both consumers and for professional people who may work in jobs and in positions where one of the things that they have to do is they may have to manage fuel so that that fuel can be used in some capacity to get a particular job done. And that means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everybody. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, we want to talk about a recent event that we believe is going to be pretty transformational when it comes to what we drive in the future. Because of it, we believe that the automotive landscape in the United States is about to undergo a fundamental shift that will forever transform it. Now, we have had tipping points in the past, points where something happened that forever changed what we drive and changed our expectations of what we drive. One such recent happening was the introduction of the SUV in the last couple of decades. Those who got on board with that change, like Chrysler, Ford, Honda, they saw their business blossom. Ford so much so that in 2018 they stopped making sedans altogether. Those who missed the boat on the change, they really suffered, all because of how the SUV really changed the entire auto landscape in the United States, and how some people recognized this and took advantage of it, while others miscalculated and did not. In 20 years, when we look back, the year 2023 may be recognized as another one of those tipping points. So, what are we talking about when we say that? Well, on April 12th, 2023, the EPA officially produced new mobile source regulations that include but are not limited to new limits on tailpipe emissions for several broad classes of vehicles. And the changes that were proposed by the EPA, they were rolled out in two separate rules proposals. One proposal was for vehicles that are classified as light duty and medium duty, and then the other proposal applied to more than half of the many subcategories of heavy duty highway vehicles. Now, due to the historic strictness of what the EPA is proposing, those changes are expected to have a huge positive impact on both the environment and on human health. And the proposals are going to have a profound effect on the auto industry as a whole, to the extent that in 5 or 10 years, we may hardly be able to recognize what's at the dealership anymore because the auto industry is going to be forced to shift its offerings at a historic level. So let's dig into these details. So, to start with, let's talk for a moment about government agencies and the rules and restrictions that they create, which end up falling on our shoulders. Now, we all know some of these federal agencies that make up rules and mandates that we then have to obey. For example, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, they tell us we have to file our taxes every year. The Federal Trade Commission has rules that limit the ability of businesses to get together and conspire or collude to influence the marketplace in ways that make the marketplace less free and less open. But there are limits to what kinds of rules that each agency can make. And those limits are primarily governed by the agency's stated mandate. So the IRS cannot decide to make a rule that, let's say, colleges must give male and female athletes equal access to sports teams. Now, why not? Well, because that particular area isn't in the Internal Revenue Service's area of mandate. It doesn't concern the IRS's purpose, what it was created to do. So the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, also has a mandate, and its mandate all has to do with two big areas, the environment and also human health, because the environment has such a heavy impact on human health. So anything that the EPA does, including any kind of rule or any kind of mandate that the EPA wants to propose, anything like that is supposed to fall under the agency's defined mandate to protect and improve the environment and human health. So when we talk about the EPA proposing limits on vehicle emissions, the EPA can do that if there's strong enough evidence that the vehicle emissions substantively affect either the environment or human health or both. And it's pretty clear that they do. And so that's why the EPA can even propose these kind of things. Now, in terms of its mandate towards the environment and health, the EPA projects that these strict new emissions limits are going to have some pretty profound effects and positive effects in those areas. But we also know that they're also going to have impacts that are going to be felt in many other areas across the board. That's one reason we know that these emission limits are going to force other changes that we think are going to result in a transformation of the nation's cars and trucks that we will frankly never turn back from. And that is to say, a big, some say forced transition away from conventional gas and diesel powered engines, what we would term internal combustion engines, over to zero emission electric and hydrogen vehicles. We think that's ultimately going to be the biggest effect on the marketplace that these EPA emissions proposals are going to result in. They're going to force the country essentially to buy and drive more zero emission vehicles. Now, the country has been dabbling on the fringes of that kind of shift for the past few years. But despite that, electric vehicles, or what we may call EVs, they're still a pretty small slice of of car sales across the country. And this EPA proposal is going to be a game changer, we think, because it's basically going to shove the country forcefully towards a future where there are a lot more electric vehicles and a lot fewer vehicles with internal combustion engines. We say shove the country forcefully. Some people might characterize it as dragging the country, kicking and screaming towards that. So once news of this proposal got out, much of the ensuing discussion characterized the proposal as the EPA, or depending on who you talk to, the EPA's boss, the Biden administration, mandating more electric vehicles. But that's not exactly what they're doing. These new targets from the EPA, they're centered on requiring dramatic reductions in the different kinds of tailpipe emissions that come from vehicles. And to understand what's being proposed, we have to understand that what they're talking about in the proposal are emissions averages. Now, in that way, they're just like the EPA fuel efficiency standards that have been around for decades. And sometimes you may hear those referred to as CAFE standards. Now, like those CAFE mileage standards, the proposed emissions limits don't apply just to individual car models. They govern, or they apply to the average of the fleet emissions, quote unquote, of all the different types of vehicles made by each automaker. Now, when we say fleet emissions, the term fleet here in this context refers to all the different models of vehicles made by a given automaker. So Honda has a fleet of vehicle offerings that are comprised of all those models of small and medium cars like Civic and Honda Accord, and then also their SUV models like Passport and Pilot, and then other models, other vehicles as well. All of those models that Honda makes together are its fleet. All the models made by Ford, Hyundai, Dodge, Chrysler, all of those are their respective fleets of vehicles. So what these new EPA emissions limits do is dramatically lower the upper limits on the average emissions measured from all the different models that every company makes. Now, we have to point out that it's the average because some vehicles in Honda's fleet, for example, might create more emissions, and that might, though, be offset by another model in its fleet that creates lower levels of emissions. You add all of them up together, and you get the average fleet emissions for that company. And that is what this EPA rule proposal covers. So The significance of these new emissions limits, the reason why so many people are raising their eyebrows about them, stems from how drastic the proposed cuts are, and also the implied changes that they or anticipated changes that they're going to force the auto industry to make in terms of what the automakers can sell to the public. So, how bad are they? Well, in order to meet these new EPA standards, Honda and every other automaker are going to have to decrease their average fleet CO2 emissions by an average of 13% per year every year between 2026 and 2032 until the average CO2 emissions across their fleet have dropped down to just 82 grams of CO2 per mile by the year 2032. Now, don't miss this. We said 13% drop. It's a 13% drop each year on a year by year basis. And what that means is 2026 emissions have to be, carbon dioxide emissions have to be 13% less than 2025's. Then the next year, 2027, has to be 13% less than 2026. 2028 must be 13% less than 2027, and so on, all the way up through the model year 2032. Now, for perspective on how steep a drop that actually is, compare that goal to the landscape that we have right now. Now, we know that the cars and trucks that we have today are cleaner than ever before. And the average new vehicle in, let's say, the model year 2021, they emitted 347 grams of CO2 per mile. CO2 grams per mile, that's how they measure carbon dioxide emissions. So under these new EPA proposed limits, they have just 9 model years to cut that from 347 all the way down to 82 grams per mile. So that is a pretty big cut. But it's also not just carbon dioxide emissions that the proposal covers. I mean, it is scientific consensus that CO2 contributes to climate change, so regulating carbon dioxide would fall squarely within the EPA's mandate. But there are other kinds of emissions targeted by the rule, and these are all emissions that are bad for both air quality, but also, very importantly, bad for human health. So NOx, what they call NOx emissions, that's nitrous oxide emissions. Another emission you might see designated as PM 2.5, that's particulate matter 2.5. Those are the really, really very small carbon particles from fuel that are small enough to get way down into people's lungs. So they're covered. VOCs, emissions of volatile organic compounds, those are covered. SOx, sulfur compound emissions. All of those emissions are also targeted for reduction by this proposal, and their reductions are required to be at least 50% lower over the length of that term. So, at this point, it looks like some pretty big changes are coming. And people, by and large, don't like change, especially if it comes down or results from being told that they have to do something. In fact, some people may push back on this, and they may question whether the EPA even has the authority to require these kind of cuts. So, let's answer that objection. Somebody objects and says, the EPA doesn't have that authority. You can't tell me what to do. Well, to answer that objection, we're reminded of a podcast episode we did here on the Fuel Pulse Show podcast earlier this year. And it was regarding the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by Congress and signed into law earlier in the year. Now, if you haven't listened to that episode, it would be worth your while, because one of the key points that we pulled out or pointed out during the show was that the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, was the first piece of legislation that defined greenhouse gases like CO2, defined them as air pollutants. And that was important due to the fact that The IRA was not an executive order from the Biden administration. It was legislation passed by Congress and signed into law. And that means that regulating greenhouse gases, because it was part of that act, regulating greenhouse gases now became part of the EPA's official mandate by law. That illustrates the importance of something like this being part of a bill passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. It becomes whatever's in that bill becomes defined as law. So nobody can then go to the Supreme Court after the fact and challenge it in court saying the EPA is overstating its authority if it wants to regulate greenhouse gases. They're not, because the EPA's mandate has now been changed to include regulating greenhouse gases. The IRA is what gives the EPA the authority to do what we are talking about now. So, backing up again slightly, remember that we said earlier that for CO2 limits, the EPA's new proposal was that CO2 limits were required to drop by 13% every year, but only starting in 2026. I mean, it's 2023 right now. Why aren't they starting in 2024? Well, that's because there were already required reductions already in place that were going to apply to the model years 2023, 24, and 25 through 2026. The new rules or the new proposed standard that just came out simply builds upon those already in place and accelerates those cuts even more dramatically. So, carbon dioxide emissions are being slashed, particulates are being slashed, harmful nitrous oxide and VOC emissions that combine to form smog and ground level ozone all are being required to be steadily cut over a relatively compressed period of time and faster than ever before. The end result of all this change is that by the year 2032, the US is going to have the most stringent tailpipe emission limits for cars in the entire world. And such drastic reductions are undoubtedly going to help both the environment and human health. So these rules become, these rules hit the news, and suddenly all people are talking about are not, hey, we're going to have cleaner air and lower levels of VOCs in the air. No, they're not talking about that. What they're talking about is electric vehicles. Now, the reason this EPA proposal has been characterized as some kind of Biden administration EV mandate is because it's an open secret that in order to have any hope of meeting these strict requirements, automakers are going to have to sell a heck of a lot more electric vehicles and other zero emission vehicles than they currently are. Indeed, the EPA itself openly recognizes in its proposal that it's going to have to be that way. Now, because they know this, the proposal from the EPA hits or covers some other areas relevant to electric vehicles, typically in the realm of new proposals for rules that govern battery and fuel cell durability standards and battery life monitoring standards and defined minimum warranty requirements for electric vehicles, because they realize that if one big result of their proposal is that everybody's going to have to buy electric vehicles, then it would be a good idea to have safeguards in place to make sure that the automakers have some minimum standards in place to make sure that those EVs remain a sufficient level of quality product. So under the proposal, the EV batteries are now going to have a minimum warranty period of at least 8 years and 80,000 miles. Now that's the minimum. Many EV makers already warrant their batteries for longer than that, but at least the EPA's proposal is going to say we have to have a minimum 8 years, 80,000 miles starting point across the board. So that's a good thing. The rules are also going to require electric vehicles to have onboard battery health monitors. That also seems like a good idea if you're proposing rules that you know are going to result in electric vehicles becoming a dominant part of the auto market. So, despite these things, at least appearing to be good things, obviously the big thing that the EPA is proposing here is the dramatic reduction in vehicle emissions. The question now becomes, we've already said what those reductions are going to have to be. The question that comes from that is, how are the automakers going to reach those goals? Now, the first thing to understand in any situation like this is that while the EPA proposals lay out they define the goals and the limits, they're telling the automakers where they have to get to by what time. So while they do that, they don't mandate or they don't tell the automakers what they have to do to reach those goals. And that's a good thing, because essentially what they're doing is they're telling them where they have to be by what time, but they're leaving them free to decide how best for themselves to reach those targets. Now, the most clear takeaway is that in order for any of them to reach that goal by 2032, a lot more zero emission vehicles are going to have to be sold. And remember, zero emission vehicles doesn't mean just electric vehicles alone. I mean, electric vehicles are what people are talking about, but a zero emission vehicle could also mean a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. I mean, hydrogen fuel cell technology has been under development for a while now. And personally, we think that it would be a really good thing if this new EPA proposal forces that technology to be accelerated, to have accelerated development to the point where we see, by 2032, we see hydrogen fuel cell vehicles becoming a substantial part of the market. That would be a great thing. Now, beyond simply selling more EVs and more hydrogen vehicles, we also might start seeing some other different emission control technologies being used by automakers. We might start seeing, special filters, special filters on gasoline vehicles to trap and reduce gasoline particulates getting out in the air. We might see some of those starting to appear in the marketplace, similar to what diesel vehicles already have. Yet it's clear that, even though we have things like filters and secondary emissions control technologies, they're really going to be a small part of the contribution. Only a massive increase in the number of zero emission vehicles in these automakers' fleets is going to get the country to the point of meeting these standards. And the EPA knows this. And so they came up with their own projections on how EV sales might be increased as a result of what they're proposing. So we start with what the situation is right now. We already said they've been trying to sell EVs out in the marketplace, but they've been a pretty small tertiary part of the whole picture. In 2019, new car sales, EVs were just 1.4%. I mean, that's pretty negligible. 2020, they were 1.7%, still pretty negligible. 2021, you start to see a little bit of a higher jump. They're up to 3.2%. So that's almost twice what it was the year before, but still pretty negligible. 2022, they're up to 5.7%, which again is what, four times what they were 3 years ago, but still only a really small part of overall vehicle sales. And no doubt when next year, when we start talking about what percentage they were in 2023, that percentage will have increased, a certain amount as well. So the number of EVs is rising steadily year upon year, but apparently not fast enough to affect the kind of emissions reductions for the environment and for human health that the EPA wants. So now cue these proposed limits, and let's see how they're going to cause EV sales to rise dramatically. If the EPA projections are correct, then by 2032, so we're talking 7 model years from now, the EPA estimates that 54 to 60% of all new vehicles sold in the United States are going to be electric vehicles. And then by 2032, it's going to be close to 2/3. Now you're talking about a substantial part of the market, and that's just for the light and medium duty cars. Remember, we said there was also that whole other class of vehicles covered by the proposals, the heavy duty vehicles. Those are the what they sometimes call the vocational vehicles. So you're talking about the trucks, the buses, garbage trucks, delivery trucks, all those heavy trucks used in the workforce. The EPA estimates that by 2032, 50% of those heavy duty vocation vehicles are going to be electric. So, since the EPA has a mandate to push for things that improve the health of the environment around us, if they're going to propose something like this, they have to provide justification on the specific effects that they want to that this proposal is going to have on the areas that they have a mandate for, i.e., the environment. So, in order to make this kind of proposal, the EPA can't just make up a proposal and just say, here it is, go do it. The EPA by law has to justify and provide a pretty extensive justification for how this particular thing that they're proposing helps further their mandate. So the EPA estimates that over the life of all these newly composed vehicle fleets that are made up of, 60% zero emission vehicles, they estimate that we're going to cut out nearly 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, 10 billion tons sounds on the face of it like a big number, and yet 10 billion tons is a meaningless number unless we throw some context in to give it some meaning. 10 billion tons is equivalent to twice the total CO2 emissions for the entire country for the entire year 2022. Okay, now we see it's a substantial number. Now, one thing we do have to point out though is it's carbon dioxide emissions over the life of those vehicles. So we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions not for 1 year, but over a 10 to 12 to 15-year period. But even when you realize that it's reduction over a decade or a decade and a half, it's still a historically substantial drop, 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now remember, when we talk about fewer emissions are usually tied to reduced usage of fuel and petroleum. If you have fewer emissions, it's usually because you're use or at least partially as a result of using less petroleum fuel. So if these lower emissions limits are going to result in substantially reduced carbon dioxide emissions, it stands to reason that it means we're going to be using less oil. And the EPA estimates that again over the life of these new vehicle fleets, the 10 to 15 years, America's dependence on foreign oil is going to be cut by over 20 billion barrels over the course of that period of time. Now, we do have to point out, because we do try to be fair about these things, classifying, talking about the EPA says reduction of foreign oil, yet to be fair, classifying it, a reduction of 20 billion barrels as reducing dependence on foreign oil, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because our national energy picture will always be made up of a combination of oil imported from other countries, but also oil that's domestically produced here. It's always a combination. And we're never going to stop importing oil from other places. Remember, contrary to popular perception, our biggest import partner for oil is not the Middle East. It's actually Canada and Mexico. But the point here is that when these changes are followed through, we're all going to be using substantially less oil all around, no matter where we get it from, as a result of what the EPA is proposing. Now, that's the environmental side. Let's switch to the health side. Now, whenever this kind of proposal is implemented, the positive effects that it sees, yes, they're good for the environment, but they're not just good for the environment alone. Remember, the EPA is also charged with improving human health. And the argument that the EPA gives, and which nobody really disputes, is that a big reason why all of these different emissions like VOCs and particulates, the big reason why they need to be reduced is because they hurt human health. So with these new lower limits, the EPA projects that reducing these petroleum limits across the board to the level they're proposing, it's not only going to affect greenhouse CO2 levels, it's going to dramatically affect fine particulate emissions that otherwise cause premature death, heart attacks, respiratory, cardiovascular illnesses, and asthma. Not to mention the health effects that come from reducing NOx and VOC emissions, especially for children. Children in urban areas that have high levels of NOx and VOCs and ground level ozone, which results from those things, that's really, really bad for their developing systems, for their brains, for their lungs, for their developing cardiovascular system. It's terrible for those things. So a positive effect of this is going to be, it's going to help all of those children in those areas. So we're going to see some really positive benefits, both in the environment and in the important markers for human health in both adults and children. And that is exactly what the EPA is mandated to do. So, in its analysis of its proposed rule changes, the EPA has talked about effects on the environment. They've talked about projected effects on human health. They've talked about how many more EVs it's going to cause the country to buy. But what they also did was they included a bunch of information on the projected effects of their proposal across many different other areas, including the financial realm. See, positive effects on the environment and human health always translate into financial savings as well. And it's part of its proposal. The EPA ran cost benefit analysis on the projected effects of what they were proposing on areas in the financial area. In fact, all agencies are required to do this. They're all required to take these kinds of steps when they're proposing something like this. See, not many people know that it is the law that if an agency wants to enact a rule change or enact a new policy, they actually have to prove that the financial benefits of the change are going to be a net positive. In other words, they have to prove that this new policy that they want to do is not going to cost more than it brings in. That's been the law for some time now. So the EPA wants to propose this, they have to show some positive cost benefit. And so in its analysis for what it was proposing, the EPA estimated that when you looked at all the different areas that this proposal was going to touch, and you added up the costs and the benefits for all of those areas, they estimated that we would see a net positive of over $1 trillion. So that seems pretty good, right? And yet, such a figure not as meaningful to the average person or the average business as one might hope. So let's narrow the focus down to the person or the business level to try and give some context here. So people, whenever we talk about these kinds of things, inevitably, if they don't say it, they're still thinking it. They're thinking, what about my budget? What about my pocketbook? What is this going to do to me? When we start talking about more electric vehicles, many of the informal arguments against electric vehicles made by individuals, they always seem to focus on considerations like, well, what's that going to do to my electric bill if I have to charge this thing? Yet, the real truth is, electric vehicles have lower maintenance costs and, of course, lower fuel costs than gas-powered cars and trucks. Now, the next time that you go to the gas station and you complain about the price of gas, maybe it's $3.50. I think here in Florida today it was $3.72. Maybe it's for a gallon. Maybe you live in California and it's $5 or $6 a gallon. The next time you go to the gas station, you complain about the price of gas. Think about what it would be like if you never had to pay for gas again, or to pay for oil changes or transmission maintenance, because electric vehicles don't need either of those things either. So you don't have to pay for them. Now you're saving real money. So translating this to a cost per, how much real money are we talking about here? Well, if you look at it on a cost per mile basis, the cost per mile to run an electric vehicle versus the cost per mile to drive a gas powered car. On a cost per mile basis, electric vehicles cost about 20% to run versus a gas powered car. Now, that's not 20% less than a gas powered car. It's 20% of the cost of a gas powered car. In other words, 1/5 of the cost. So, if you're going to take a trip, say 300 miles long, and it costs you, I don't know, $50 to fill up your tank to go 300 miles, with an electric vehicle, on average, wouldn't cost you $50. It would cost you $10 with an EV to go the same distance. So, all in all, when you take all these things into account, lower gas, the cost to charge, the reduced maintenance, everything like that, when all of that's taken together, the EPA estimates that in switching to electric vehicles, the average consumer is going to save about $12,000 over the vehicle's life. So when we dig down into those kind of details, they almost seem to render many of the objections to electric vehicles almost kind of curious. For many people who are the most vocal about electric vehicles, it almost seems more of an issue that they don't want to be told what to do. So if they think that somebody's telling them they have to do something, they're going to object to it, even if that thing is ultimately going to save them money in the long run. That's not as important to them as the fact that somebody's telling them that they have to do that thing. Then someone else raises their hand and they say, okay, yeah, I understand about, don't have to pay for gas, but what about the carbon footprint of these electric vehicles? They have to mine all those metals to make all those batteries, right? And depending on how grumpy they are, they might talk about, oh, those bureaucrats, they think they're so smart. They never consider that stuff, the yada, yada, yada. Well, not exactly. The argument that comes up when electric vehicles are the topic is that supposedly electric vehicles have such a large carbon footprint at the beginning of their life that either they never catch up or it takes them an extraordinarily long time to catch up because they have such a huge carbon footprint with the batteries and everything that goes into making them. Except this isn't exactly true. And we know this because there are groups like the Nonpartisan Fuels Council, and they did a 2022 analysis where they looked at this very issue. Now, the Fuels Council is an excellent group. It's a public policy group. They do really good research on big public policy issues like this one, because they want to produce good information that gives people nonpartisan answers, not slanted to one way or the other way. So the Fuels Council wanted to ask those exact same questions and see what the answers were. So they compared electric vehicles and gas-powered vehicles on their carbon footprint. They took everything into account. Everything that you and I could possibly think of, they factored all of that into the equation. And what they found is, first of all, yes, electric vehicles do have much higher carbon footprints going at the start of their life cycles, going into making them. The typical electric vehicle has a carbon footprint of about 39 tons of carbon dioxide, 39 tons of carbon. The average gasoline-powered car starts out with a carbon footprint of just 17 tons, so less than half. So already the electric vehicle is 22 tons of carbon ahead or behind, depending on which way you're looking at it. But once people start driving them, obviously the electric vehicle is not burning fuel. And so they're starting to shrink that gap. They're starting to recoup some of that difference. And so what the Fuels Council found is that, again, generally speaking, on average, the electric vehicles pull up or break even with the gas powered vehicles, and then they pass them around the 90,000 mile mark. And then every mile past that, the electric vehicle is moving ahead in having a lower carbon footprint. So that's kind of the answer. Yes, electric vehicles have a higher carbon input to start with. And yes, it takes them a certain amount of time to catch up, but it is not fair to characterize this as they will never catch up, or they won't catch up until way down deep in their life, because an electric vehicle is not going to last for 100,000 miles. It's going to last for 300,000 miles. So that's the story with the carbon footprint. And so those are all some of the financial impacts that we may likely see. But there are still some other anticipated effects we might see if these limits go into place. One of them is that if they're going to make all of these electric vehicles, they have to have places to make them, which means manufacturing facilities. That means there's going to be a lot of competition across the country, local municipalities competing to provide land and spaces and to lure manufacturing facilities to be built in their areas, because that means tax revenue for them. That means new jobs for locals in the area. So that's a good thing. It's going to cause more competition for that. And yes, remember, we did mention batteries a few times when we talked about carbon footprint. And one of the big elephants in the room in all of this, probably the favorite one that anti-EV people want to point out, is the problem of the what we'll call the rare earth minerals problem. The fact that so much of the supply of rare earth minerals needed controlled by China. They're gonna have to solve that problem, but the way I think about it, I'm not a professional in that area, but I have confidence that if I can think that that's a problem, they already have a whole bunch of people who have already been working to try and solve that problem. And so I think that they're going to find a way around that. The other big elephant in the room is the power grid. That's the other one that people tend to cite. If you're going to have 60% of new car sales be electric, you better have a much bigger network of charging stations. And not just more charging stations, but fast charging stations. Because not only do you have to give people places to charge their vehicles, you can't have people stacked up in line waiting 20 minutes to charge their vehicle. That's not feasible. Now, two pieces of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, they already set some of those wheels in motion with respect to setting aside funding to start attacking this problem ahead of time, to the tune of about $120 billion. So right now, at 2023, we only have about 120,000 charging stations currently. And that's not nearly enough. Okay, that's not anywhere near enough. We'll put it that way. Even though it's still 40% more, it's up 40% from what we had a couple of years ago. And we would expect to see over the next 4 to 5 years, there's going to be some major movement on that front, because the Biden administration has been pretty clear in its goal of seeing 500,000 charging stations built in time for meeting this kind of demand. Now, if the number 500,000 doesn't mean anything to you, to put it in perspective, the number of gas stations that we have across the country right now is about 150,000. Now imagine 3 times as many charging stations being available to charge your electric vehicle. And they're going to need to make sure that all those places, all those charging stations, are actually located in the places that they're most needed. That means two big areas of concentration. First, they gotta have enough of them in the urban areas. That stands to reason. But also, they have to have them in the rural areas that currently don't have any charging stations. I have a friend I went to college with. She lives in rural Appalachian, Ohio, right near the Ohio-West Virginia border. And she commented that if she had an electric vehicle, the nearest charging place that she knew of for her was about 2 hours away. that's going to need to dramatically change, and it's going to require some time and some input resources to do that. So, what happens next? So, to recap up to this point of what we talked about, the Environmental Protection Agency, a federal agency tasked with protecting the environment and protecting human health, they just issued a set of wide ranging proposals that dramatically lower the amounts of harmful emissions that vehicles can emit. So, now that they've made the proposal, what happens next? What are they allowed to do? How are they allowed to go about making this work? Um, how does the rule making process actually work in this kind of thing? Well, for this, it's governed by the same kind of process that governs any kind of government agency action. And since most people don't have a good idea how these things are done, it's good for us to re-examine how these kinds of rules get made in our governing system in the United States. So, the way that whenever somebody wants to do something like this, the way they have to go about doing this is governed by a number of pieces of legislation, including the Administrative Procedure Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and a few other acts that have really boring names. But this is basically how, what they call the rule-making process, how it is supposed to go. Okay, so up to this point, the point that we're at right now, we've already gotten past what they call step one of the rulemaking process. They typically call that the pre-rule stage. That the pre-rule stage is where an agency like the EPA, they look at different, there's a problem, and so they look at different solution alternatives to try and solve said problem. So they look at all the different solutions and try to settle on what they think is going to be the best way to solve that problem. Once they've come up with that, then they're going to do a cost benefit analysis. Remember what we said before. If they're going to propose anything, any rule change they make has to be accompanied by a good argument that the benefits of it are going to outweigh the costs. So they do a cost benefit analysis, and they take all the information they've got up to that point, and they use that to submit what they call an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, and they put that into the Federal Register. Now, the EPA did all that sometime last year, 2022. And the reason that they do this is they want to put this out there so that the public can see that they're thinking of doing something. And if the public sees that the EPA is considering making a proposal in this area, they may have an opinion on it. They may have some helpful comments. So the public is has the opportunity to comment on whether they should even be doing that in the first place. So they do all that. We've already passed all of that. And if all this checks out, and the EPA up to that point still believes that the specific action they're thinking of, they still believe that's the route that they need to go. Even if they're convinced of that, they can't just say, okay, now we're going to go do it. No, they still have to do some other things. First, they still have to get authority from either Congress or the president to take action. And that's because a general rule of administrative law is that a federal agency cannot issue a rule like this unless they're granted authority to do so by law. So, the agency will petition for that authority. They'll petition Congress or they'll petition the president. And the EPA has already done that. They've already cleared all those hurdles up to this point. And so what we're up to right now, the point we're up to right now, is the EPA on April 12th, what they issued was they proposed a regulation. They proposed it in the form of what they call a notice of proposed rulemaking. So they've done that. We're at this notice of proposed rulemaking stage. So the next step where we go from here is the EPA is going to publish their proposal. In fact, they may already have published it by the time we're filming this blog. They publish their proposal in the Federal Registry so that it is publicly available for anyone in the public to see. Then begins something very important, a 60-day comment period. And during this 60-day period, anyone can review the EPA's proposal. They can review all the details, all the stated rationale and arguments that the EPA came up with. They can review all the evidence that the EPA cited in supporting what they think they want to do. And they can submit comments on any of that. They'll do it a number of different ways. They can go to a website called regulations.gov and submit comments there. Some agencies, not sure about for the EPA, but for many agencies, they can also submit comments by email. They can mail them in, or if they're still living in the Flintstone days, they can fax them in. So the public gets to submit comments. Now, as you might expect, for this particular subject, there's going to be thousands of comments, lots of comments. And some of the comments, they're going to be all different kinds of comments. Some of them will be, one sentence, you stink, stuff like that. Others might be long scientific treatises on why it's a good thing or a bad thing. It could be hundreds or thousands of pages long, and it might have detailed analyses. They might have supporting studies and supporting documentations, which they would attach to the comments. And after the 60-day period ends, the EPA has to read all of those. And they take all those comments, they collate them, they combine them together, and they take all those comments and they combine them with all of these other relevant materials related to their proposal, records of hearings, everything that was contained in that previous notice of public rulemaking, all the economic analyses and environmental analysis, all of that stuff, and they combine all of it and they create what they call a docket folder for what they're trying to do. And they make the docket folder publicly available for anyone to look at. So what do they do after they do that? The agency then takes some time, they review all of those comments, and they may, depending on what those comments do or say rather, they may need to run some analyses or, look at some things, whatever. The EPA then decides based on all the input that they've gotten. The EPA then makes a decision on, do they want to proceed with the rulemaking process that they started? Do they want to proceed without making any changes? Did any of those comments change their mind? Or maybe somebody pointed out something important that the EPA didn't consider. Maybe they found, could be anything. Maybe the EPA missed something. And the EPA might say, oh, that's important. We should take a closer look at that. Maybe it might cause them to say, I know we wanted to do X, but maybe we need to change that. So if the EPA feels that some kind of changes are warranted, what they're going to do is they're going to withdraw their proposal and they'll start the whole process. They'll make the proper amendments, and then they might start the whole process over again. So if the EPA doesn't feel that any changes are needed after they've looked at what everyone has to say, then they prepare what's called the final rule, capital F, capital R, the final rule. And by law, final rules have to have certain things associated with them. Final rules have to have a preamble, and they have to have a rule text. The preamble part is important because the preamble includes the EPA's response to any and all of those significant relevant issues that were raised in the public comments. And the preamble also has to contain a statement that lists out or makes plain the basis and the purpose for the rule that they are putting together. Now, typically agencies will respond to all the public comments in that preamble, or if they need to make changes, they will, or if this is like their version 2, if they withdrew and made some changes and then resubmitted all of this, so this is like their second go around, if that's the case, then they will typically have some kind of written record of that, a written response to the public comments in their withdrawn proposal document. So once they clear all of this, they will publish this final rule in the Federal Register. Now, we're not quite done yet, because once they publish the final rule, that does not mean that it takes in effect, the next day. By law, any final rule can't take effect less than 30 days after it's published. So there's like a 30-day period. There are a few exceptions to that, like if it's an emergency situation, which sometimes there are emergency situations, but in most cases, there's a 30-day period between when the final rule is published and when it can actually become the law of the land. Now, what can happen during that 30-day period? Well, it's very likely that if it's a controversial thing, and anything having to do with the environment like this, probably controversial, it's very likely that somebody is going to take the opportunity to file a court challenge to these proposed limits that we've been talking about. Now, that's probably going to happen during that 30-day period. And the reason why they're going to file it then, as opposed to, let's say, right now, is because if they file it during that 30-day period, the final rule has made clear what exactly everything that's being done without any changes. So basically, it's clear what exactly they're challenging, right? So they file a court challenge, and the court looks at their arguments, and the court might put a stay on the limits, or they might not. Depends what exactly is being argued and the merits of that argument. One thing that they won't be able to do is argue that the court should stay the rule because the EPA doesn't have a mandate. We can thank the Inflation Reduction Act in this case for making that a moot point. And then the final thing that we'll say about all this is these kinds of rules, they typically like to structure the timeline of how the process unfolds so that the rule can go into effect around, let's say, December the 1st. Now, I do know that there are certain rules that govern about how if something doesn't get proposed or finalized by, let's say, May, it can't go into effect the following, the coming December 1st. But the EPA has always stated in this case that their goal was always to have this over and done with by December. So I don't know exactly how that timeline is going to play out here, but I would be pretty confident that the EPA has done whatever they need to do to meet that goal in terms of submitting things by the dates that they need to have them done by, so that this new emissions rule goes into effect August the 1st, 2023. And so that is all for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. You can find information about everything that we talked about today in the show notes. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast at your favorite podcast platform. That's iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you like to get your podcasts. Also, if you haven't done so already, if you would leave us a rating, that would be great, because that's really helpful in helping people find us. So thank you again for joining us for today's episode. I am, once again, your host, Eric Bjornstad. I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. I will see you next time on the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.